Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do appreciate you being with me. My Friday sessions here on YouTube are called Responding to the Critics. And on Fridays, I normally address some article, some video, some book that has been produced in the hopes, the vain hope, of refuting covenant eschatology, otherwise known as the full preterist view. Now, just recently I asked my viewers here on YouTube to make the suggestion about what they would like for me to cover next after I had finished reviewing Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism. And, it was torn back and forth between several different suggestions, but the number one leading candidate, their number one request, had to do with review of a book entitled The Future of Rome. Now, this is somewhat of a scholarly book, and this book was first suggested to me, as I've already pointed out, by Derek Lambert, a former preterist, former Christian, who is now an atheist. And Derek was supposed to try to find somebody to debate me on his program. He couldn't find anyone. Then he suggested that he and I just have kind of an informal discussion. I said, that's fine. But then he didn't want to do that. And so he then recommended that I get this book because it was his claim that this book would answer any argument that I might make for the early dating of the book of Revelation and its application to the fall of Jerusalem. So when I mentioned this as one of the possibilities, the majority of people, the majority of you, suggested, let's do this review. Let's talk about the dating and application of the book of Revelation. So that's what we're doing. So I've already pointed out to you that basically the very first half of the book has nothing whatsoever to do with the dating of the book of Revelation. All right? Nothing. But we come to chapter 17, chapter 11, on page 106, in which Peter Oakes sets forth his reasons for believing that the book of Revelation was written at a later period of time, and it refers to Rome and the ultimate destruction of Rome. Now, Derek Lambert set this book forward. This is supposed to be the definitive, the definitive refutation of the early day. This is supposed to be the definitive explication and establishment of the late date and application of Rome. But I have to tell you, just on pages 206 and 207, there are so many things that are simply glossed right over, virtually with no explanation, simply mentioned, and then assumed to be talking about Rome. I find this extremely troubling. I find it less than scholarly, and I find it tremendously weak. So last week, I shared with you that one of the very first things that just jumped off the page at me is found on page 206, in which Oakes says, the remembering, quotation marks, of Babylon sets the stage for the subsequent chapters. I agree with that statement 100%. But what Mr. Oakes fails utterly, not a comment, to observe is that the word that is used here for remember, Revelation 16:19, is the counterpart and the synonym to the word that is taken from the Old Testament that is then translated as remembered, which is the Hebrew word zekar. I pointed out to you, zekar is not simple mental recall. It is a covenantal remembrance. It is when Israel was faithful, God remembered his covenant with her to bless her. When Israel sinned, he remembered the covenant, and he brought the law of blessings and cursings to bear on her. So the point being, whoever Babylon was in the book of Revelation, she was in some kind of a covenantal relationship with God, and as a result of her sin, and specifically the sins of killing the martyrs of Jesus and Yahweh, God remembered those sins, those bloody crimes, and was going to bring covenantal wrath on Babylon for her violation of covenant. Let me reiterate, folks, this is so critical. Remember did not simply mean, oh yeah, I remember who Jerusalem or I remember who Rome is. No. Has nothing to do with that. It is because of Babylon's actions that God recalled his covenant with her, recalled the fact that in his covenant with her, Deuteronomy 28-30, the law of blessings and cursings, God said, when you do this, I'll bless you. When you do this or that, I will curse you. And here is Babylon guilty of shedding the blood of the saints. Well, let me tell you, God couldn't remember Rome in that covenantal context because God was never in a covenantal relationship with Rome. Never. Zero. Zilch. What's he saying these days? Mic drop. End of story. Now, that segues perfectly into the very next thing mentioned by Mr. Oakes on page 207. But once again, he simply glosses right over it, does not go into any detail in the ensuing discussion that is substantive in any way. What is that? Well, let me read it to you. Paragraph, almost the last paragraph on the page. Pardon me. John then hears a great crowd in heaven calling out praise to God for the judgment of the harlot and the avenging of the blood of God's servants. Chapter 19. Pardon me. 1 and 2. Okay. Enough. So Babylon is the great harlot. And Oakes does try to set forth the idea that, well, Rome was the mother of harlots. Rome was the source of corruption. Rome was the source of fornication and immorality and injustice and on and on and on. I'm sorry, folks, that doesn't address the issue of the word harlot. You see, we have to understand and we have to remember this is absolutely critical. All right? Let me see if I can adjust this a little bit. We have to understand and we have to remember that John in Revelation is drawing extensively. Some scholars estimate that John in the book of Revelation cites, echoes, or alludes to over 400, do you catch the power of that number? Over 400 Old Testament passages, mostly prophecies. Now ask yourself this question. If John was so overwhelmingly concerned with the Old Testament and Old Testament prophecies and the fulfilling of Old Testament prophecies, does it not therefore make perfect sense to at least argue, to at least make the suggestion of an argument, okay, John is concerned with the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. He is concerned with the passing of Babylon, i.e., the harlot. Does it not therefore behoove us, and are we not justified in saying, okay, here is John using the word harlot for some city. What city in the Old Testament consistently and persistently used the word harlot to describe the city? When we ask that question and we answer it biblically, then guess what that does? It absolutely 100% excludes Rome from being Babylon. Why? Well, let me point out that one scholar by the name of Sebastian Smolars has observed, pardon me, that in the Tanakh, the Hebrew word that is translated as harlot is used some 91 times. And by the way, I found this information after I had written my book, Who Is This Babylon? I wish to goodness I would have found it beforehand, because the information would have been in this book. I can guarantee you that. And one of these days, I may revise this book. I've got some really, really good additional information that I want to add to it, but it'll make the book even more, lengthy. So anyway, Sebastian Smolars says that the word that is translated as harlot is used 91 times in the Old Testament. Okay? Now, please catch the power of what I'm about to share with you. 86 of those 91 times, the word harlot is used to speak of Old Covenant Israel/Jerusalem. It is used 2 times. Outside of that, it is used of Tyre, it is used of Nineveh. But both of those cities dealt specifically with Israel as the covenant people. And here's what Smolars continues to point out. This is devastating. In the Tanakh, the Hebrew word translated as harlot is used to describe a wife that had become unfaithful. Wow. So we have the word harlot used 86 times in the Old Testament to speak of Israel and Jerusalem. John is drawing directly on that imagery. Furthermore, and in addition, the word harlot not only referred in the humongously preponderant number of occurrences to speak of Israel/Jerusalem, but here's the kicker. That word is used in those 86 times to speak of Jerusalem and Israel as a wife that had broken the marriage covenant. For instance, Hosea chapter 2 is a prime example of this. Yahweh was spiritually married to Israel in Hosea, the 10 northern tribes. But he said of Israel, his wife, you have played the harlot, going after other lovers, worshiping other gods, spiritual adultery. So let me ask you a question. When was Rome ever in a marriage relationship with Yahweh? Answer: never. When was Rome ever called the wife of God? Answer: never. And thus, when did Rome ever violate the marriage covenant between herself and Yahweh and become the harlot. And by the way, we have this additional imagery in the book of Revelation of this city. And she has a forehead that is proud, and she's identified as a harlot. Well, that takes us back to Jeremiah. I believe it's chapter 5. If anyone wants that text, I'll have to look back at that. But in Jeremiah, God was speaking to Old Covenant Jerusalem, and he says, you have a proud forehead. You have the forehead of a harlot. See, there are all those constituent elements that are brought into it. Harlot was referring not simply, now it could have that, the word harlot could be used in a non-marital context. For instance, in Genesis chapter 37, in the story of Judah and Tamar. But that's an exception, see? It is an exception. So my point being, if you're going to come to the book of Revelation and you're going to say, well, yes, it's the harlot, but it's Rome, who was never in a marriage covenant relationship with God, never violated the covenant, etc., then you've got to produce some really, really, really strong evidence from Revelation where that word harlot is being used in a totally different, totally distinctive way from the way it's used in the Old Testament, which serves as the source of the book of Revelation. So, here we have a book that is supposedly a definitive defense of the late date and identification of Rome as Babylon, and yet the writer, Mr. Peter Oakes, simply mentions in passing, well, John, here's a great crowd in heaven calling out praise to God for the judgment of the harlot, and we're supposed to believe that automatically the great harlot is Rome. Well, I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that is a gross oversight. And when we go into the rest of the chapter, we simply find headings: why Rome falls, Rome's violence, we'll get to that later, and we come down to Rome's arrogance and her luxury. We come down to Rome's influence and how Rome falls. Listen, folks, none of that has one iota of relevance to the issue of what did harlot mean. So I would ask the question, how can it be argued that this chapter specifically is a definitive refutation of the early dating and the application or interpretation of Babylon as Jerusalem, when some of the very key terms, the key marking terms that are used in the book of Revelation to talk about Babylon as the great harlot, as one that was to be remembered, covenantally remembered, how can it be said that this is a definitive refutation of the Jerusalem view when you do not even examine some of the foundational key words that help us identify who Babylon was? And let me say again, I consider that a huge oversight. I consider this to be a prime example of the power of presuppositions. It is not a key and deep-rooted exegetical examination of the book. It is an eisegetic presentation of what the writer believes to be true, and then imposing that view onto the text of Revelation. And I'm going to demonstrate that even more as we continue. For instance, next week, I will look at Mr. Oakes' statements, once again on page 207, And I kind of glossed over it when I read the sentence. So here it is again. John then hears a great crowd in heaven calling out praise to God for the judgment of the harlot and the avenging of the blood of God's servants. Revelation 19, 1 and 2. I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that Mr. Oak's identification of Babylon as Rome on that point alone goes up in smoke. Now, let me remind you once again that I have written a book on Who is this Babylon? And during the time that I am doing this series in review of the future of Rome, if you go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and you order Who is this Babylon, I will refund your shipping. That's going to save you $6.95. Okay? So take advantage of the offer. Go to my website, order the book, Who is this Babylon? I have to say, just over the last week or so, I've been getting some incredibly wonderful feedback on all of my books, but particularly this book. One person after a person said, when I read Preston's book on Babylon, I was completely, totally blown away. It was a life-changing experience to read this book. Okay? So again, do yourself a favor, order the book. I'm out of time. Don't forget, join Mike Sullivan and me tonight on Preterist Apologetics. Boy, you know, we're just getting more and more and more wonderful feedback on this show. And I got to tell you, I just got to tell you, Mike Sullivan and I, we have our differences, obviously, but Mike Sullivan and I, we are having a ball in bringing this Preterist Apologetics to you. I think you could tell that by watching us, okay? But the point of it is, we're bringing some really, really substantive, power-packed evidence mounting up in confirmation of the full preterist paradigm, okay? Be sure to join us tonight/tomorrow. See you there.